Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute, just waiting for some folks to continue to filter in here. You're just joining us. We're just waiting about a minute or so to let folks get into the webinar from the waiting room. Looks like that's slowed down, so we'll go ahead and get started while folks continue to trickle in because we've got a lot of content to get through this afternoon. So good afternoon again, and welcome to our webinar on Shaping the Future, Key Trends in Real Estate, Finance, and Economic Development. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your host and moderator this afternoon. Here's a quick overview of our webinar. We're going to do some welcome and quick introductions of our panelists, and then we're going to hear presentations from Cosmont companies in the city of Placentia, followed by a discussion and some audience Q&A, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 2:30. On this next slide, so we will welcome questions and comments throughout the webinar, but you've probably noticed that you are muted, and you will remain muted for the duration of today's webinar just due to the size of the audience and helping us limit the background noise and all of that. But you should have a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and you can submit questions at any point throughout today's webinar. We'll be keeping an eye on that, answering the ones we can as we go, and then we'll be pulling most of the content related questions into that Q&A towards the end of the day. So we did receive quite a few questions ahead of today's webinar, and then obviously we'll take as many as we can from what we get live here today, but there is a lot of questions, so I just want to note that we'll get through as many as we can, and then we'll give you ways to follow up with all of us if you have questions that we don't have a chance to get to during the live webinar. So before we get started, just wanted to share a little bit about ILG in case you aren't familiar with us. So we are an affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So essentially, we provide easy and practical resources so that you all as local agencies can more effectively implement policies on the ground. So we do this in a number of areas. We focus on leadership and governance, so kind of that governance team. How do you work well as a council and board with your staff and work together as a team and with the community? We have a program focused on civics education and workforce, so helping create a pipeline to public service, work through some of the challenging recruitment and retention issues that we know you all are dealing with, and really just get more people interested in local government as a career path. We also have a program focused on public engagement, so helping local agencies embed public engagement into their operations. How can you do it more strategically, more authentically, more proactive, and thinking about things like language access and meeting design and facilitation. And then lastly, we have a program focused on sustainable and resilient communities. So recently, we've been doing a lot around housing and land use and climate action, but we also have resources for local agencies and an award program in terms of energy efficiency projects and sustainability best practices and greenhouse gas savings and things of that nature. So we provide training and education, technical assistance, capacity building, convening services to cities, counties, and special districts statewide. So if you aren't super familiar with us, definitely encourage you to check out our website, see some of the resources and trainings and offerings that we have that hopefully will make your lives a little bit easier and help you do your jobs in a more efficient fashion. So I want to introduce today's presenters. I've got 4 fantastic presenters on the line with me today. We have Larry Cosmont, Ken Hira, and Julio Morales from Cosmont Companies, and then Damian Arula, who is the city administrator for the city of Placentia. And they will be walking through presentations each, and then again, we'll bring everybody back together towards the end of the session to walk through some of those discussion and questions and Q&A from you all in the audience. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to the Cosmont team.
Great. Am I okay to start, Melissa?
We're getting the slide deck pulled up right now. There should be good to go.
Perfect. Well, welcome all. There are so many of you on the call, and I think that's pretty reflective of the topic that we're going to go through today. Before I get there, I just want to thank ILG for its leadership for counties, cities, districts. There's no better confluence of information and well-intended distribution of policies and programs to help us all run our communities and really take advantage of the knowledge that's out there. So Melissa, Erica, thank you very much. We're Cosmont's privileged to be part of the ILG team, and we enjoy that relationship. Today, I have a presentation that is supported by four incredible professionals, all of us working day and night at the confluence of economic development, real estate, and public finance. And the reason that's important is because we're at a time where we have a new economy. The economy has changed on us, and the thing is it hasn't told anybody. It just sort of crept up on all of us. Things that we took for granted, like retail shopping centers, are no longer a lead investment for the private sector. The notion of higher density as an imposition on local governance was a foreign notion until the state sort of went down their policy roadway and induced it. And then no one could have predicted the level of shortage of housing that we have that actually supports the state's position on local control, but the way it's done presents incredible challenges for us. What we're going to talk about today is, what is this new economy and how does it work? And what are the characteristics today as we sit here? Because the interesting thing, and I think to wit, the reason we have almost 200 participants today, is that this economy is at a crossroads, make no doubt about it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll go through some of the high-level trends and identify where I think we are and how we can deal with it. Ken Hira, president of Cosmont Companies, who's a former retail developer and has been running Cosmont for over 15 years, has a very good presentation on what are the elements of land use that you need to pay attention to, what's real, what's not, and those components of land use and real estate uses have really shifted. You'll see that nothing's quite the same. Julio Morales, Senior Managing Director of Cosmont Financial Services, former city manager and finance officer, has a very good handle on how you can loop together the efforts of economic development and finance. In today's world, as you'll see, what we'll tell you is the convergence of economic development, real estate, and finance couldn't be more apparent. If you don't treat those three subject areas in a comprehensive and strategic way, you're just going to miss being productive and successful in this economy. And then finally, last but not least, Damian Arula, who has been the city administrator of Placentia for about 10 years. He is the example that we use at Cosmont in terms of how to put together these programs in a small to medium-sized community. How do you work a toolkit and get great results? And, it's always a work in process, but the reality is he's made a lot of progress. And we'll close out with a roadmap. It's really Cosmont's view and what are the four key approaches for economic development. So let's get started on this. So in terms of where we are, the key to note for all of us is, as I said earlier, nothing's quite the same, right? We have a reconfigured economy, and the actors that have reconfigured it are none other than consumers, investors / developers, and government policy, whether it's state or local. These three forces acting independently have changed the landscape for all of us as economic developers, as city managers, as council members, as mayors, as local leaders. And it's not going back to where it was. So consumers today are driven by quality of life. Well, you say, well, they always have been, but no. Their priorities have changed. I mean, where they live, the fact that they don't want to commute, the consideration of family amenities and community amenities and experience-based retail is really what's driving a consumer today. They want it all in a 15-minute community. And by the way, for many of our clients, that's been a benefit. The key is, how do you capture that? Because in reality, the wallets in the rooftops in our communities are staying there longer. So we have the opportunity of really keeping those wallets there and not losing them to a major regional downtown like Los Angeles. It's a major shift. The investors know this, and they're driven by how do they position technology with this shifting demand? How do they reconcile supply chain anomalies and breakdowns? And how do they accommodate, support, invest in, and deliver on live and work patterns? So they're really seeking to get value out of these new demand drivers that are really generated by consumers. Because make no mistake, in the United States, we are a consumer economy for sure. And then local government's kind of in the middle and on the sidelines concurrently, right? And on the sidelines because, we're watching these trends. We are a service business when we run cities. We don't make products. So we're trying to react to consumer and investor preference. We're trying to figure out which land use applications we should approve. We're trying to decide which investments we ought to make in which public-private projects. But we also know that we're in the middle of a fight between the state and the economy to shift things. The state wants to shift the economy so it produces a significant larger amount of housing because we're so short on it. The state's not wrong in the sense that if we don't have housing, we lose our workforce because we can't keep them here. We're already starting to experience that. Beyond that, the state is pushing resiliency and zero emissions, a whole energy policy shifting us away from an oil-based economy. These are major tensions that we deal with, next slide, in the local economy. And will the recording be available to us? I think so. Melissa can answer that question. Okay, so let's talk about real estate and the land use revolution. Here's what I would say to you. Nothing really quite acts the way it did. Let's take hotel. Hotel, 10 years ago was as much tourism as it was and destination as it was business. Today, it's about extended stay and exceptional destination. It's either experience or functionality. Everything in the middle is sort of sidelined. Retail is being entirely reimagined. It's really not even retail anymore. It's a experience-based set of uses next to other uses. That's what retail is. It isn't like we're putting up retail and they're coming, right? Office reconfiguring. Well, the stories are there. I'm going to talk about the office reconfiguration, and so will Ken in a very significant way. But office is not coming back the way we knew it. It's also not going away. But the changes in office are so mysterious right now because it's a fight. Really, how does the office of the future look? Where is it located? And how much of it really gets repopulated? Residential has gone through a renaissance. And face it, industrial is the new retail. It is the delivery system for retail. If you cannot deliver your product, then a storefront won't help you. Okay, so it's really the backbone of retail, and it's been a very successful product in the last 3 to 5 years. Next slide. So as we go forward, what we find is that nothing is as it was just a short while ago. Housing, which used to be, I think a lot of us, I was a 26-year-old city manager at a time when the instructions from the city council was, can you get me a Nordstrom or a Costco? The truth of it is that in today's world, housing is a centerpiece for economic development because people are buying, living, playing out of their home and neighborhoods. So the net negative impact that all of us have believed housing presents is really quite adjusted. And Cosmot's really working hard to figure out how we can adjust our models to reflect, again, while it's staying longer, more activity in a household, putting rooftops next to retail as a savior to retail, because guess what? Retail reimagination is a core strategy for economic development. We are so over-retailed in the United States that the only thing we can do is right-size it. And COVID really accelerated this trend. The question is, what's the right blend? What's the right mixed use of projects? How do we integrate housing? How do we integrate trip-generating uses? Because we used to measure retail in terms of sales per square foot. I think it's trips per square foot because that's where you get your sale. And then telework has reconfigured office. No one really wants to go back 5 days a week. Even the major employers are starting to quietly capitulate to a hybrid week. And so that really takes job distribution and ties it directly to housing. Back to column 1, because housing, for example, I'll tell you that there are a number of cities in the Midwest and in the South, their economic development program is no longer geared to the employer. It's geared to the tech worker, to the service worker, to those people that improve the community and have spendable. Makes sense, because again, housing's the leader here, jobs are the follower in this economy. And then industrial distribution is absolutely critical. It is the nexus between retail. It is the delivery system for quality of life. And it is bringing, as a result, a good number of jobs, some good, some better. And it also comes with impacts. We know that. Okay, next slide. So the state's policy overlays all of this. So you have this capsizing real estate economy that couldn't be any different than it could be, right? And then you have a state that has a huge set of levers, produces 2,000 legislative statutes a year, and it's all about control at this point. How do we control a solution for housing? How do we control a solution for global warming? How do we make our energy conservation green? These are major initiatives. And so you're going to see and continue to see dozens of statutes that change the equation around land use. Some of it's energy driven, some of it's climate driven, some of it's density and housing driven. AB 2011 eliminates parking needs near transit. 423 extends 330, which is all the giveaways on density bonus and all the exemptions from zoning, local zoning. And SB4 enables churches or religious institutions to go to work and use their property for housing. So if you don't think everything's changing, you're just not living in reality. Everything is changing. It will continue to change. Next slide. So putting it all together, and this is the mindset that really sets up Ken Heer's discussion, right? Because you have state policy on the left. I feel like it's a three-way boxing match, right? State policy on the left. It's land use in the middle, because what happens is, make no mistake, the private sector is getting pretty good at figuring out that they have free zoning from the state. So guess what? That is going to drive their land use applications. I'm sitting in meetings these days where developers are going, maybe I'll 1862 this, I'll 330 it for the exemption on zoning, and I'll 2011 it because I can have less parking. My lender will say, okay. That's a conversation that didn't exist 4 years ago, but that's happening. So when you're thinking about land use, you have to think about two things. What's the developer going to ask? And number two, what do you really want? The third thing on the right that you have to think about is, how does it produce viable economic development? How does it let my community capture the value of this private investment, which is coming in a very different way? You see, value capture strategy matters. We are now, all of us, are in the value capture business. And the way you capture it is what we're going to talk about today. You're going to hear these tools. Next slide. So one other notion to make things even more, perplexing, and that is the financing market. I just came back from the Urban Land Institute conference. I was a speaker there. 3 days of downtown LA. I have never seen as many developers cry at the same time. Why? Because guess what? Their financing has pretty much left the town. And they're really now looking at money sources much differently. In our view, at Cosmont, there are three kinds of investors. The opportunistic folks that have money, sitting on the sidelines going, whoa, Real Estate Friday is coming. I'm going to go buy it at discount. No doubt. The stuck in the middle of it, like the song, Stuck in the Middle with You, right? Middle of the deal, needs money, struggling to find financing. And this really affects all of us on this call, because right now, I guarantee, I see a bunch of cities, counties, and districts, guarantee that many of your lead projects, if they haven't had the conversation with you, they're about to. And don't wait for it. Call them up and say, where are you on your capital stack? Where are you on your equity and debt? Because many of the developers are sitting there, heavily invested, stuck in the middle, got their zoning, and now they can't get financing. And they're afraid to come to the city to say things have changed. Someone asked the question in the audience about how do you use TIF to support public-private projects. We'll talk about using EIFDs and tax increment to underwrite for a portion of time the deal so you can get unstuck in the middle. Because without that assistance, in our view today, many of these projects will quietly go away, and go to the sideline. Third is, oh yes, shopping centers and office buildings that are going back to the bank. And you can see on the right, the high level of office and retail that is outstanding current distress. The yellow is the potential distress, by the way. And so all of the things that we were talking about, the change in product types, the change in state policy, and now the upheaval in the financing marketplace, this is where strategic economic development has to come to play. And that's why you can't think of real estate, you can't think of finance, you can't think of economic development with separate hats on. It is one big happy family that needs to win. And a lot of it's because we're truly in a in a challenging economic and financing environment. Okay, just wrapping up here, what's happened, just to summarize, our preferences on consumer side has changed, our project financing is stuck, the state has stepped up for local decision making, and the question for all of us, what do you do next? How do you respond to a compelling future for your community? Next slide. How do you generate private investment in a way that recognizes these trends? Because it's not about big boxes anymore. It's about creating a neighborhood on a former shopping center. It's not about large office parks. It's about capturing teleworkers and keeping them in community. It's not about avoiding industrial, because without it, you can't deliver goods. And it's not about looking at residential density as a loss leader or a distant cousin, because it's got the highest residual land value and it brings rooftops, which supports all these other uses. Different game. So going forward, what do you do? What Ken is about to talk about is that the need to react to private investment can only come if you know what private investment is experiencing. So he will go into some detail about these land use changes, because I think all of you are going to be responding to some very tough equations for public assistance, very challenging questions about changing zoning or changing an occupancy or a tenant, very tough questions about providing infrastructure when you hadn't made that commitment before and may have to make it again. Okay, so you're going to have to figure out what to choose, what to induce, and how to move that forward. And then finally, in telling you, next slide, in letting you know what these trends are and how to respond to them, we're going to come back and let you know, of course, what are the tools that you can do. For example, you can capture value from tax increment. You can capture value from the real estate that you own, and that would be sort of the outgrowth of the Surplus Land Act, which is forcing you to sell sooner than later anyway. And you can also sell your zoning. In other words, you don't have to give it away in a specific plan. That's a notion that no longer has legitimacy in this economy. So we could talk about that. And you can trade off for revenue in a sales tax agreement or in a development agreement. You can also pursue other public money to help augment the financing challenges that we are experiencing. So today's program, my last slide, Ken Hira will talk about land use reimagination. Julio will talk about looking at your financing mechanisms. Damian will talk about the City of Placentia playbook. And by the way, we have two Julios. This is Julio Morales, not Julio Fuentes. This Julio Morales is a finance guy with less hair. Julio Fuentes is a real estate guy with more hair. Okay, so just want to clear that up. And then I'll come back and summarize the approaches to economic development. Ken, take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Larry. I love the hair jokes. I won't go there. Really glad to be here. Larry talked a lot about sort of the what, and I'm going to try to spend a little time on the how. You know, the analytics for all the land use revolution and asset evolution, if you will, is where we dig into with our clients on a consulting basis or a brokerage basis or a public finance basis to help enlighten what's really going on in the marketplace. I'll have two different slides here with graphical representation of about a 4-year trend on economics. So you can tell here in Los Angeles County, and the next county I'll talk about would be Sacramento, but in Los Angeles County, you can see the winner. It's not different than how Larry laid out industrial as being basically one of the winners. You'll notice the green graph. Industrial rents have grown over this 4-year period in LA County at a pretty steady pace. Home prices, on the other hand, have fluctuated quite a bit, but still are in a winner category, if that makes sense, at a 35% growth. Hotel, of course, is one of the more interesting asset classes in Los Angeles County, as COVID had a major impact in the occupancy of hotels. But you might have heard during the pandemic that the hotels might realize a swoosh or Nike swoosh recovery in the graphical representation of their decline and then growth. And sure enough, hotels are back. ADR's average daily rate, they're back at a 21% clip over that 4-year period on average in LA County. Multifamily rents, which is interesting, is about 9%. You'll see a major difference between that and Sacramento. Retail rents at 8%, close to being pretty flat, all things considered. And office, one of the most challenging of all asset classes is basically at a flat circumstance in LA County. Next slide. Compare that to what we've done in the analysis for Sacramento County. And I just wanted to take two counties, big counties in Northern Cal, Southern Cal, and just show you how we can evaluate the analytics. We can do this for a particular city. We can do it for a particular county. We can do it for a particular trade area. Industrials in winter in Sacramento. Home prices, again, up 29%, similar to LA. Hotel, major decline during the pandemic. And it's come back because of the leisure traveler is back, as well as what Larry mentioned, which was the extended stay concept and format. Multifamily rents at 20%, which is much higher than LA County in terms of the growth from a pre-pandemic to a post-pandemic level. And then retail rents at 10%, and office actually had a little bit of health at a 7% increase, different from LA County at 0. So you can tell how we drill down and try to understand how analytics can assist in the decision-making for economic development purposes, which is a big priority for most cities that we do work with across California. Next slide. The old world of retail is not coming back the way we used to appreciate it or enjoy it. Raise of hands, how many folks are still shopping at a Kmart or a Sears? Yep, I saw about 300 hands go up. And, those folks aren't coming back in any way, shape, or form. Bigger isn't better. Retail is really in a right sizing mode, and I'll share some statistics with you. But the boxes are not the way retail is working anymore. Department stores are not the way retail is working anymore. You do see some interesting partnerships between companies like Toys R Us and Macy's and Sephora and Amazon and Kohl's and even Petco and Lowe's. So you're seeing sort of some of the consolidation between retailers. If you can't beat them, join them, as the saying goes. Next slide. What's working, what's changing, and what's not working? Well, what's working is food, fitness, service, entertainment. Here's some headlines, okay, from one of the publications, Rebiz Online. Open air lifestyle centers take over the US suburbs. And this demollification in the suburban environments is something we're all experiencing. Any community with a mall, which is the what's not working concept or category, any community with a mall really is probably not sleeping at night. Look at the Wall Street Journal headline, local malls stuck in a death spiral, plunge in value. The reality of malls is in a trade area where there's 3 malls, it's probably good for about 1.5. In a trade area where you have an A mall, that might survive, but any of the B and C malls are really going to struggle. And so go to the middle column, what's changing, it's the blending or integrating of uses. You've probably heard me use the phrase blended use. I use that instead of mixed use because of the intense integration between land uses. Western Real Estate says the urban future is mixed use, 24/7 and more outdoors. Outdoors today, public space, green space is like your new anchor tenant. Another Western real estate headline, why retailtainment creates community and boosts sales by attracting customers. Entertainment and trips, also like Larry mentioned, that's what's driving traffic. That's what may drive spending. But at the end of the day, people want experience. Next slide. Right sizing of retail. Our country has 23.5 square feet of shopping centers per capita. How does that compare to the rest of the world? Just as a comparison, Canada at 17, Australia at 11, UK at 5, 4, 3, Japan and China respectively. We have a lot of retail. Our country was built on retail. The mighty sales tax dollar is helping a lot of local communities and governments, but it's shifting. There needs to be a right sizing of that retail. You can see in California, you got about 23.2 square feet of shopping centers per capita. In LA, you've got 21. Look at what it is in Sacramento, 43.9 square feet of shopping centers per capita. So we're either overbuilt or we're under demolished, as the saying goes. Next slide. Growth in e-commerce may have something to do with the change in the big box retail, jumping 30% in Q2 of 2020. And thank God for that. During the pandemic, there are 150 million consumers with Amazon Prime in the United States. That's obviously even larger in the world. 150 consumers. That's a lot of folks who are shopping online. I'll ask another raise of hands. How many folks are shopping on Amazon? Yep, all 300 of you just raised your hands. It's something that's here to stay. E-commerce, the share of retail will continue to grow. Next slide. Housing is economic development. So live, work, shop. What's interesting about the home or a residential unit is we used to just live in it, sleep in it. Today, we work in it. And of course, in the recent past, we started to shop in it. So when you think about it as an economic development tool or benefit to a community, notwithstanding its shortage, pursuant to all the RENA requirements, but it truly is where people are doing all things, if you will. Where is the job located if you're there in your house working remotely 3 days a week or 2 days a week? We've actually taken this and quantified the square footage of retail and office, and how if you consume that and subsume that in a residential unit, how much demand is there really left for the traditional format of office and retail? And we've done that analytically for different communities. So this is sort of the how of the analysis of land use and what makes sense and what doesn't in your community. Next slide. The office world isn't coming back. Obviously, teleworking and hybrid working, not to mention the artificial intelligence and digital tools that are reshaping how business operates. Next slide. The trick to office conversions, you'll read a lot about these headlines. It's not that easy to convert to residential. There's not been much conversion. Zoning restrictions, structural complexity, high project costs, all are impediments to just simply converting office to residential. But the notion is worth exploring. Older office, smaller footprints, they tend to be the ones that might be feasible for conversions to residential. Next slide. Industrial is a lifeline to retail. It's all about a doorstep or consumer economy. It's how we get our goods to the storefront or to our doorstep, which has a lot to do with what? Distribution, fulfillment, last mile delivery. And I know that these are challenges, if you go to the next slide, when certain cities have to then um, uh, hear about projects and take an applicant who wants to build more industrial, which generates a lot of trips, a lot of traffic. It has impacts on roads. It has greenhouse gas emission impacts. So there's an analytical win and lose between how much industrial we really end up allowing versus retail, frankly, versus residential. Next slide. What's coming? What's coming is this concept of blending of uses. Retail, residential, industrial, all seems to be converging. If you look at retail, you'll see many of the retail stores today that have fulfillment components. Target does it. The grocery stores do it. The box retailers do it. Even the department stores, who's ever left, they end up having a little mini warehouse, frankly, within their stores. So there's so much convergence and blending of the types of uses. It all also points to how we look at our zoning. Cities need to take a close look at zoning maps and actually create zoning strategies, things that we get involved with to help cities understand what will make sense on a go-forward basis. Next slide. Same with office. What are we going to do with all the office? So we kind of make up terms, resi-mercial. Can office really be components of apartments? Is office really a conversion to residential? Can it be remodeled? Our home space is really being designed to incorporate certain office components. So we're really in an evolutionary period of time. Expect office properties to do some converting, maybe even to industrial, but it's something that concerns us in terms of the economy and how the banks are going to really accept the real estate back. So we need to keep an eye out for these very densely office populated communities and central business districts. Next slide. Data tools, as you can tell, we get pretty analytical in what we do and try to help our city clients and our developer clients. So I came up with a new term, you've heard of economic development. We're kind of using techonomic development to help bring services and add value to our client base. And that's the utilization of as many technologies as we possibly can to help enlighten us. Esri and Smith Travel Research and CoStar and Placer AI, which is a artificial intelligence platform, which we utilize. And so we think bringing these services and bringing the technologies, which is how the consumer is functioning today and the investors are functioning today, become very important added value components to economic development and economic development services. Next slide. So last thing I'll discuss is just city tax revenues, and it'll be a good transition into Julio's presentation. But you can see the volatility between the three main tax revenue sources that support a general fund. Property tax has always tended to be pretty steady. It represents about 40% on average of the city general fund. Sales tax is in about a 22% ratio, but it's more volatile. If you looked at sales tax on a graph around 2008, you would have seen a far dramatic decline, a little bit like TOT during the pandemic. But when people didn't have jobs, they're not spending a lot of money on sales tax. If you look at what's happened as a result of the before the pandemic and after the pandemic, it's been relatively stable. There's been a decline in sales tax revenue in the general funds, but frankly, it's come back to a ratio pretty close to 22%. TOT, the transient occupancy tax, clearly has been a volatile tax revenue source. However, a very strong one because it's a direct benefit to cities' general funds. And we oftentimes analyze that from a fiscal impact perspective, but major decline when people weren't traveling. And the good news is that it's come back. It used to be about 8% of city general funds on average. And today it's back into the 6% range after declining all the way down to 3.5% post-pandemic. So you can see the volatility and the elasticity of these tax revenues, which become essential to analyze. And we use this kind of information for almost all of our economic development strategies and plans and market evaluations that we provide to our city clients. So on that note, I think I'll transition out of this and probably hand it over to Julio Morales to talk about budget finance for the new economy. Thank you. You're on mute, Julio.
Thank you, Ken. Just to follow up on that same concept, if you can go forward 2 slides, really from a financial perspective, one before, the key is understanding your economic drivers, right? And just think of a pirate, revenues at risk and reserves. That's what I'm gonna focus on. It's not about your budget. It's really linking economic development with the financial stability and resiliency of your city and your city's finances. So next slide, you can take a look at it. Look at the revenues. Ken just went over this. And we look at property tax was really the stepchild back in the 80s and 90s. Everyone was chasing sales tax because Prop 13 kind of limited your property tax. Now what you have to do is be cognizant of the changes that you're making, of the economic development strategies should be integrated with your overall economic profile in the city. So when I look at this, sales tax, TOT, development impact fees, those are highly volatile revenue sources. And you have to just take it in consideration. There's nothing wrong with it, but understand that when you're looking at your economics. And the next slide, when you look at your expenses, you really have limited control. Most of the salaries and benefits make up the majority of everyone's budget, especially cities. So there's not many things you can look at. You have capital repairs and replacement, contracted materials. Once again, looking at the volatility of the revenue and expenses and take that in consideration in your decisions and integrating with your economic development strategies. So what do? Well, the first thing is set aside your reserves based on that. And the first thing Ken noted is economic uncertainty. So next slide, when we look at economic uncertainty, the first thing you should look at is 2008 and see what your unique city did. Ken was looking at the difference in Sacramento or another city. It really depends on your sales tax or your TOT, but you should set aside your reserves for economic uncertainty based on that last Great Recession. Then there's one other point that I always talk about is what I call the fallacy of recovery. I think people are myopic and they go, oh, well, our sales tax was 2 million. It took us 2 years, we're back to 2 million. If you're counting that as your recovery, you're wrong. Because there's something called, I call it the point of convergence. You're growing now, your expenses at 3% per annum, you're still behind. And it's going to take you a while to recuperate. So if you look at this slide, the point of convergence where revenues kept up with expenditures is not 3 years later. It's more like 13 years later. And then you have to set aside your reserves, because if you have this type of situation, you could effectively eat through your reserves if you don't make the appropriate cuts. So pair your understanding of your economic drivers with long-term financial forecasts, and don't go with the old model, oh, we're back to the same level, we're okay. You have to exceed that level and catch up, because your expenses in most cases, you have an MOU, you have other inflation that's going up. Your expenses are going up while your revenues took a decline. So it's going to take you longer than you think to recover. Next slide. So the second concept is understanding your own internal working capital. Now, you pay the same pretty much expenditures throughout the year, maybe with the exception of debt service and pension in the beginning of the year, but payroll is that big component. You pay that same amount monthly. And in California, if you have property tax, you're going to have a big payday in December and in May. And most likely, like most cities, you're going to run out of cash in October and November. So how much reserves do you need? At least this to have internal capital. Aside from the downturn, that's your working capital. So you have your economic uncertainty, your working capital, and then lastly, an emergency event. And do you know about emergency event? Next slide. Yeah, you have them all the time. Floods, wind, fire, Santa Ana wind, social unrest. You should know that from the past and expect that FEMA only gives you 75 cents on the dollar at best and is very late to do so. So you set your reserves in accord to these economic development strategies. And this is really important. This is what enables you to do other projects. Because as Ken was saying, and as Larry was saying, we're falling behind. They need to fund that gap, and they're going to look to the city to help out. And at the end of the day, if you don't come and help fund that project, they don't see lines. They don't see that line that you have across the street. That's the county or the neighboring city. So they're always going to look for competing resources. And the stronger financial position you're in, the stronger you're going to your economic development strategies can be. Next slide. So here's what we think is different or changing in the future, is the role of the public sector CFO. And what is that? Well, next slide. It's the finance director. You have to provide basic financial services, pay employees, repair and replacement, debt service. That's the basics. But what should you be doing? You should be working with the rest of the city departments, but you look beyond the budget. If you're looking just the budget and annual report, you pretty much lost. You're looking to seek investments that are going to maximize your revenue, diversify your economic base, looking at how a project can add to your project. So you should be looking at density, FAR, how that project is going to add value. You should be in that room talking to the economic development team, talking to the city manager and developer, and understanding how that's going to change your city's finances. If you're looking at the budget or staying in that room thinking about the budget, you're behind. And then looking to leverage those resources, creative financing mechanisms, learn about that alphabet soup of mechanisms, and then look at how to leverage all your resources. Some projects are better than others because you have additional grant funding sources. You have transit-oriented development or other kind of grant monies. Pay attention to that. That's your job as the finance director serving as the CFO. Next slide. So here are the axioms for the future. We like to say this. 1, understand your economic drivers. The past was sales tax, the future is property tax. You need a creative problem-solving culture. You need an integrated approach that removes the departmental silos. That's really important. You shouldn't be back thinking about the budget in CAFR. You should be in that room as one of the key decision makers, leveraging your balance sheet and finding resources. There are going to be new winners. This is important. As the economy is shifting and land use is shifting, you really have to understand those who get to the table and understand and adjust their real estate or their economic profile are going to be the new winners in the future. And once again, revenues at risk and reserves. Pay attention to that because that's what's going to set you in the strong financial position. So what are the tools in the toolbox? Next 2 slides, please. The things that we pay attention to at all points, you should have reserve policy, investment and debt policy. Those are all great. But at the end of the day, you should really look at a couple of things. Address your pension funding issues. That is going to kill you because those are fixed dollar payments. You should have a 5-year CIP with matching revenue sources. And probably right now, a long-range financial planning model and a fiscal assessment are critical to understand where you might be in the near future in the economy. Once again, all of this has to be integrated with the economic development side. So your housing element, RENA compliance, surplus land act, you have to be thinking about those as a finance director or as a finance person at the same time. And lastly, that strategic plan and economic development strategy all has to be integrated. It can't be the community development department or economic development in finance. They have to be integrated in the way that you think. Next slide. So you'd asked about some financing tools. Here's the way that I look at it of the new alphabet soup. You have land secured financing, which are CFDs, Melrose, and assessment districts. And you have new tax increment financing, which are EFDs. The formula actually isn't any different. In the old days, when you're doing these blended use, mixed use projects, you do CFDs to input or build the public infrastructure that would grow the assessed value, and then you'd be able to do tax increment bonds. It's not much different. You're looking to facilitate development. Developers are going to ask you to help them with a funding gap or help with the capital stack, and CFDs and Mello-Roos can really help. And then once that project grows, the sticks are in the ground, then you can do an AIFD or some form of tax increment. So the formula is the same, just different sets of acronyms. Okay, last part, the new playbook. And I think this is important. So I think the role of the CFO is to help channel the resources of the city. The city manager is that leader, that he's going to call all the shots. Damien's going to tell you that. And of course, he gets the plays. The policymaking board is the city council. They're going to tell you, they always look at, I want to change this city. I want to change this corner. They're the visionaries of what they want to look and feel like. We're the ones implementing those plays. The city manager tells you what to do, and it's your job as a CFO to direct and find resources, to leverage those resources. So lastly, who do you need in the room? This is really important. Okay, city manager, city attorney, economic development team, a municipal advisor, a CFO. You need the city specialist at the same time, public works, community development. You need police and fire. Don't leave them out. That's a really critical component because they're components of that deal that you're thinking about. That maybe oh no, there's a crime element here, or there's an unintended consequence, or we have a significant homeless issue we're gonna have to deal with. Get trusted advisors in the room. All of these things are gonna put together a completely different team. So I'm gonna hand it over to Damien, who's gonna tell you how this is actually done in reality. Thank you so much, Damien.
Thank you, Julio, and thank you to the ILG team for setting this up. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I was asked by the group to really kind of talk about some of the things that Placentia is doing with respect to the city's initiatives, strategic planning, economic development, whatnot. I want to take a moment, though, to really kind of outline Julio's slides. I think they were really advantageous and beneficial. I particularly like the one about the football team lineup, so to speak, and who's running the play. That was really interesting. A different way to kind of really talk about what we do when we talk about strategic initiatives and economic development, master planning, and really all the people that need to be in the room. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is some of the things that Placentia has done, actually using those very same team players that we've had in the room. And in some cases, we've leveraged that a little bit to take the analogy a little further, maybe had a offensive coordinator, so to speak, in the form of Cosmon at times and others that have helped us with some of these things. And I'll speak to that a little bit as well. One of the things that I think you're hearing as really a common thread through all of these presenters is really just talking about really looking at the new economy, but how do you position yourself for success in the new economy, and looking at how do you master plan really for that purpose. In Placentia's case, we actually had kind of two areas. We've actually had now a third area that we're wrapping up as well. Really that focuses on some of that master planning effort that ties into kind of creating those neighborhoods that Larry had spoken about earlier. So I'll talk about our transit-oriented development, packing house district plan, our Old Town revitalization plan, as well as some of our citywide initiatives, the EIFD that came about that ties directly into some of those more historical areas that are a little bit more challenged, where we needed some new letters, so to speak, in the alphabet soup to bring about financing and leverage funding, as well as some of the things that we've done to kind of enhance these areas to make them more attractive to some of the tech workers and other folks that may be looking to locate in our community. And then talking ultimately about some of our financial initiatives that have gone hand in hand with some of the economic development initiatives. Next slide, please. So on this slide, really wanted to show this slide because the reason why this is important is really shows the whole picture of how we looked at some of the master planning. The two kind of key areas, or three areas I want to point out, is if you look at that star, I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. That is would be the newest Metrolink station going into Union Station from essentially the Paris line and through Orange County as well. And that was really kind of what I call the hub of the wheel, so to speak. And then we had kind of an opportunity to master plan around that. And what you see to the north is the Old Town revitalization plan in red, and then you have the TOD packing house district just to the south of that, and we're actually now expanding that kind of turquoise area further into the green area as a part of our housing element, because that's had so much success in the last couple of years. and planning around this area and all the other things that we did beyond just the planning, the master planning aspect. Next slide, please. So, if you take a moment, I think one of the biggest things that, I always tell people when talking about master planning is you have to have vision, and you have to be able to translate that vision into an educational opportunity to share with your staff, with your council, with your community, and be able to have those discussions about what an area can be. And sometimes that's not easy to do. Sometimes there are consultants that will even help with that. But once you start to kind of move that ball forward a little bit, you can really demonstrate what an area can look like. And I'll show you here in a moment if we click on the next slide. And before we do that for a moment, I just want to kind of share the area. The area actually was very dilapidated, hadn't been updated in over about 40 years. We actually, for those of you that have seen the movie The Hills Have Eyes, we used to call these properties the Hills Have Eyes properties because there was a lot of interesting things that would occur. We'd send out code enforcement and people would come out with bats and all sorts of fun stories that I'm sure we could talk about another day. But I think one of the things that's important is that these were basically illegal non-conforming properties, really dilapidated areas. We did a lot of significant master planning, a lot of code enforcement, a lot of vision casting all combined. And it was really, like Julio said, getting all the right people in the room together to talk about kind of the vision and what this area could be, at the same time injecting some economic development into it and really having discussions with the brokerage community and getting all these properties to really move forward. The vision, if you will, looking at this area was to make it a multimodal destination that tied directly into our old town, which is also known as our downtown area, but also offer something different and unique. It's next to a railway, it's next to industrial. And we also wanted to create a location that, although we're a bedroom community of about 52,000, we wanted to create a high density transit oriented development area that really could capitalize upon kind of creating a new destination in the community, but again, tying into kind of our rich heritage in the old town and some other areas of the city. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what we envisioned. And you can see a little bit of multimodal, some vehicles, some median slowing down traffic a little bit, and high quality transit oriented development where we have a little bit more densification. You can see on the bottom to the left also some retail. I'll get into that in a moment because I think cities make a lot of mistakes when it comes to pushing retail so heavily in high density residential developments. There's actually, in my opinion, a little bit of a right recipe to do that. But this is what it looks like. And I'll show you here in the next slide, in the next couple of slides here in a moment, ultimately what it resulted in. And we have some really updated pictures today, which is really exciting. So again, purpose intent was looking at the Metrolink station as a hub, create an active, vibrant, and pedestrian-oriented area, connect it with the old town, promote high-density residential, obviously grow our local economy. I'll get into that in a moment because I worked with, our team worked with Larry and the rest of the Cosmont team to really do a pretty profound economic benefit analysis, which was the foundation for some of our economic development initiatives. This resulted right away, actually. It was interesting. We hadn't finished even the planning process and we were already getting interest in this area. The first one is called the Herald, as in Hark the Herald, the first of its kind, in the TOD, 215 units. This actually broke a record in Orange County for the highest cost per unit sold. And they had to, they leased out in a record time. It's the same developer that has built in Anaheim, next to Angel Stadium, Santa Ana, and other areas of Orange County. A very successful project in the area. And then JPI, which is also built in the Platinum Triangle next to Angel Stadium, very interested in this area. They also moved forward on 418 units, 10,000 square feet of retail. And that is actually leasing up as we speak. And then we have another property that we're working on that's immediately adjacent to the Metrolink, proposed Metrolink platform, 189 units of affordable housing that we're working through. And as kind of Larry and the rest of the team have indicated, a different challenging environment that we're working through in terms of interest rates and trying to see if we can make a deal, an updated deal, so to speak, work. Next slide, please. So you saw, if you go back those couple of slides, you saw earlier kind of what the vision would be, and this is actually the result. So to the left is kind of the same view corridor that we saw looking down the TOD, looking eastbound. This is called the Senza development. 10,000 square feet of retail, 418 units, very high quality, what we call 360 redesign, which means every single facade or view element, view corridor, you're going to get a high level of articulation and design in the architecture, very nice materials as well. And then the one to the right is the Herald, which is the one that kind of broke the record in Orange County and was featured a lot in the various news articles. Very nice, again, a lot of articulation, very large development. These are the largest developments in Placentia, but if done well and done right, you can really create a lot of high quality in terms of the look and feel and how they integrate into the rest of your land use mix. Next slide, please. One of the things I think that's important too is that, you know, we took the opportunity to master plan both of these areas at the same time. One of the common threads that we wanted to make sure that we were doing is looking at the infrastructure in both of these areas. And so while one is more dense and has a lot of other features and is newer and shinier and wonderful, we wanted to respect kind of the heritage of our old town, but at the same time really create an investment into that area and leverage the opportunity to revitalize that area as the city's center, as the city's downtown. And so what you're going to see here is part of our vision casting that we're beginning to move forward on. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, we have some housing, we have some mixed use, you have multimodal, again, bikes, so there's an emphasis on that. Trees, street trees, tree grates, street furniture. There's actually music playing in the street lights, so it has a variety of features. Each of these areas came with the streetscape master plan that was coupled with it, that was done in parallel with the Public Works Department, where we essentially layered right below it a complete design for all of the streetscape improvements, not just doing the exercise, so to speak, on the private side for the planning and zoning, but also on the public works side for our infrastructure and our capital improvement plans. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we wanted to also kind of revitalize and create that destination. There's a great heart, I think, of the community in our old town. I think people recognize that, but they've also recognized the city's not really done as much in the past, and they're seeing a lot of that change. And we're seeing a lot more traffic and uptick in the community. A lot of our community members are also saying, you know, instead of driving to other areas or for example, a mall or some other destination, they may be going to, they've started to come to our restaurants and really stay within the community, which is nice to hear that some of the things that we're doing are working. Improving the multimodal aspect. We are next to Cal State Fullerton also, so that's important when we create housing. Cal State Fullerton is the largest Cal State in the state of California and continues to grow as such. So what I like to say as part of our education in some of these areas is that we're like a college town without the college. And truth be told, Cal State Fullerton is closer to Placentia downtown than it is to Fullerton's downtown. So this is an opportunity when we look at economic strategy is really leveraging, I like to say we leverage the assets that are around us. We also do that with Disneyland growing and the Disneyland Forward Plan in Anaheim, and looking at how we strategically approach securing hotels. We've done that over the years because we're literally 1 or 2 freeway off ramps away from Disneyland as it continues to grow, as well as California Adventure. Creating a high quality mix of commercial uses. We also want to make sure that we create the right boutique mix of retail in tandem with some limited office or work live, as well as that residential. And then obviously support some of the surrounding businesses and enhance the overall area. Next slide. So this is the economic benefit analysis that I had mentioned earlier. This was really the foundation by which we could convey the message, not only to our community, but really our city council and others that may have been skeptical about what this area will do from an economic development perspective. So basically, these 2 plans collectively will generate $22 million in net fiscal impact to the city, 50-year present value, $15 million to the county. I'll get to that in a moment. 1,600 housing units, 3,900 construction jobs, And then you see 800 million in economic output for construction, so on and so forth. It also has greenhouse gas and vehicle miles traveled reductions, which align a lot with a lot of the things that the state is trying to do, and some grants and other things that are ongoing right now that state HCD and others are really advancing, including some from the federal government. Next slide, please. So we use that foundation to really build upon creating basically the first enhanced infrastructure financing district in the state of California between a county and a city. And so subsequent to that, the LA County began to kind of really change its positioning and start to do that with LA County cities. And basically this EIFD was really designed, and if you look at that slide from the very beginning, that was kind of our map area. We used an old RDA map area. We created some limitations and some parameters because of, I was being candid with the county CEO. If I was in his shoes, every city is going to be asking for one of these. And the EIFD essentially takes tax increment financing. So a designated map area where we collect property tax, and basically the incremental growth that's associated with that area is we have approximately 50% from the county in terms of their property tax, 50% from the city, and that we capture that growth, basically set it aside, and then we can use that to bond off of by providing infrastructure. So it really is geared towards infrastructure, but we use the infrastructure ultimately in this case as the carrot to lure the developers. The developers don't have to do the same infrastructure improvements they would have to in coming into an area. We don't have issues where some areas are improved and others are not. It's essentially a clean slate, if you will, that they can come in and reduce their costs and their time, two very important things to them, by doing this EIFD. The tax increment financing and working with Cosmont's team is essentially about 10 million in debt financing, which would completely revitalize all of that Old Town infrastructure and those photos that I mentioned earlier. And then we're back-ending this. You heard Julio kind of mentioning CFDs, Mello-Roos, and other elements in the alphabet soup. One of the things that's important, I think, is cities often make mistakes is they don't support sustainably long-term infrastructure that they install. So they have a downtown, they create the location, but they're the power washing, the maintaining the trash cans, replacing street furniture, the staffing that goes along with that, the street sweeping, all of those things, and essentially those are important elements. We have CFDs for both the Old Town and the TOD are important elements to create that sustainability long term. Next slide, please. So we have a Metrolink station. The short version is this is an agreement with OCTA. We're basically also, we leveraged an opportunity to create a parking structure at the same time that would have a dual purpose opportunity. And we are basically, the entire Metrolink station, everything else is paid for by OCTA, and we're paying about 4.4 million of the total parking structure. Next slide. One of the things that's important is fiber. We're one of the early communities in the state of California to install fiber citywide. This is a $36 million investment into the community. This provides basically the up to 10 gigabits. It's very, very fast. And as you heard Larry and Ken talk about earlier, people working from home, whether it's single family residential or different type of residential, multifamily, et cetera, having fiber is really key to the future of attracting other investments in economic development, as well as kind of creating that environment where you're seeing a lot of people work from home and creating an opportunity where they can leverage their business model, which will ultimately benefit the city. So these are some pictures of some of our micro trenching throughout the city. We're about 80% complete, and we're just wrapping up the final stages, and we went live with the first neighborhood in the community. Next slide, please. So we did a couple things. We refinanced our pension debt. You heard Julio talk about that, an opportunity to really make sure we are staying ahead of the mark with respect to CalPERS. We also, in tandem with that, we basically have a 115 trust that we did, which was an opportunity to really look at both our OPEB liabilities and our opportunity to look at our CalPERS liabilities in the event that we had a change in the forecasting for that refinancing of the pension debt, that we still needed to be able to address unfunded liability. We worked with Cosmin on that. We also worked with them, I think, on something that was fairly new, is looking at treasury consulting and investment strategies. And we've been able to leverage our limited funds in ways by looking at cash flow. You heard Julio talk about CIP and cash flow. We have a long range plan, a sustainability plan, and we're able to see when we needed money. And if it was in year 2 or year 3, that would be an example where we can create an investment that had a larger return than just putting it, for example, in LAIF or some other small investment opportunity that cities conservatively and typically do. We also increased our general fund reserve, and we're now north of 25%. All of this essentially resulted in a variety of credit ratings. When I first came to the community with our team, we had what's known as junk credit status, which is essentially non-investable by the market, and now we're at AA. We also had some unique elements from S&P. We had what's called a triple notch credit rating increase. We had 3 of those, which is very, very rare if you're familiar with credit rating increases. And we've had a couple of years of double ones as well. So quite a bit of a trajectory change based on really outlining all of these things that the community has done, and the team has done working with our city council and Cosmont. Next slide, please. Bottom line results, we actually have quite a bit of change, a lot more jobs, a lot more regional economic output, moving forward on our EIFD, creating these areas and continuing to master plan and create more areas that connect to the ones I mentioned earlier. Our unassigned general fund balance has grown significantly. It's actually higher than the 6.3 million now, and we actually have secured hotels, new dealerships. The hotel industry, because we're out and about with our economic development strategy, has really taken an interest in Placentia because of our location to Cal State Fullerton and Disneyland. And then we've also revitalized 3 retail centers. But that was, all of these things I think really come with kind of what you heard from all the prior speakers, creating the initiative, having a plan, having a vision, and being able to communicate and educate that vision along the way with having the right partners as well. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Larry, who will wrap it up, because I know we want to get to Q&A as well.
Yeah.
Oh, we have one more slide. So here, in other words, one thing I just wanted to point out here is a lot of public-private partnerships. And just to be entrepreneurial, I think you heard Ken and Julio talk about this a little bit. We have 3 city billboards, partnership with Lamar, gas station lease, where we actually lease it to a gas station and get a cut of that. Same with CNG. And we have other ones that we're working on as well. So I think being entrepreneurial, I think, is another takeaway as well. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Larry. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great story. Thanks, Damian. The key here to the next slide is that we have elements of the playbook. It's just a different playbook than we've used in the past. There are some similarities, like the use of tax increment district, but the value capture aspect of all of these strategies is to create opportunity for the city, understand where the private sector is, help private sector investment by pursuing other federal funds or collateral funds, using your own leverage as a city to refund or refinance wherever you can, get value from your zoning, and get value from your reserves. I mean, when you do all these, you can have triple notch increases in credit. You can induce thousands of units and square feet of retail and office and blended use and hotel development, and you do it in the right places. It is not easy. I'm going to go to the next slide. And that's why what we try and do, just to wrap up, because we'd like to leave time for questions, is that as we see it, when you look at this Placentia playbook and you look at the tools that Ken and Julio identified and the trends that I've outlined to you in today's marketplace, this is the time where public and private sector really have to reset and how they deal with each other. The one thing that cities can do, I've seen a lot of questions about homelessness. One thing the cities can do to capture value is to lay down a district. You saw how Damian did it, and your infrastructure financing plan, which is the Bible of that district, can use tax increment for a number of improvements, enhancements, and even capital maintenance in certain cases for programs like homelessness, for opioid addiction. It's not all build brick and mortar. I mean, these value capture districts take private sector investment and convert them to infrastructure, both social and hard copy, right? And hard environment infrastructure. It's just how you position it. And the other part of this is that you can get, if you include social related investment, whether that's physical or infrastructure and operational maintenance as allowed, you can induce the county as a partner, maybe the special district as a partner. In multiple districts that we've created up and down the state, we have the county as a partner. Orange County here with Placentia is a classic example. LA has 5 partnerships with local cities. The second approach is really be careful about your zoning. I mean, the state has already come and usurped a lot of the density by making you put it in a housing element, but you can step back from there and see what you haven't put in and use value capture. In other words, charge for zoning when that developer is going to get 30, 40, 50 more dwelling units per acre of the highest residual land value out there, which is residential. And that's a partnership, by the way, to the extent that you create a district, work with an existing shopping center owner to induce higher value return on your taxes, you can reinvest in that project for the developer. It's sort of a cycle of investment, but don't give the zoning away for free. I think that really is a mistake that we are way past now that we have no redevelopment anymore. Next slide. Capture value with city property. The state has put you in a sale mode. Surplus Land Act says, of course, if you're a city, a district, a county, any public agency, joint powers authorities, you have to first put your property through a process that exposes the properties to affordable housing developers. There are a lot of ways to manage that process. Here's what Cosmont believes is the most important thing about the Surplus Land Act. It forces all of us that had properties that we had in the garage and forgot about to look at them and use them as assets, as part of a investment program, as part of an augmentation of private investment, as part of an installation basis for public amenities. It just puts us in that business. And by the way, these rules not going to get easier for us. So from our perspective, sooner is better than later. You know, I'd like to sell t-shirts that say freedom from the SLA, just haven't done it yet. I'm sure someone here listening will take that idea and run with it. But the sooner you can get past it so that you can use that asset, whether it's for affordable housing or mixed use or retail or a public amenity, that's not our point. Our point is get it out there so you can strategically put it in as part of a district, as part of a joint venture, or as public use that's accretive to all your economic development and community vitality strategies. And finally, the world has really pumped up for us other public money, OPM, and the Federal Energy Act, the Infrastructure Jobs Act, all of these sources of money, in addition to AHHC at the state level, Strategic Growth Council. There's just a bevy of money out there. The key is to understand all those trends you were talking about and start matching that other public money to an investment platform that produces the best results for you. And so just in conclusion, it is not, next slide, it's not a direct route anymore. It's just not. We're not declaring blight and going to work doing public-private deals. It's just not the way the world works. It's a convergence of land use policy, of housing priorities, of the capacity to strategically implement districts in the right locations at the right time, the necessity to implement financial management that supports all of these strands, land use, housing, special districts, private investment, in a world, by the way, that has seen 11 increases in the Fed funds target rate in 18 months. It's every 6 weeks, essentially, we've seen an increase. And that's what's frozen the credit market. We've gone from 0.25% to 5.5%, and the equity and debt market's really expensive. So all of these tools, all of these priorities, all of these programs really work now better than ever because the conversations between the public sector and the private sector ought to be exploding. Otherwise, we can't move forward in our communities. I think I'll leave it there and get it back to Melissa and apologize for taking a little bit more time than we thought, but we still have probably about 10 minutes for questions and happy to answer any you want to throw out.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Now, a lot of great information. Wanted to make sure we could get through all of that content, but we do have a lot of questions. So we'll start taking some of these. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we don't get to your question, I'll also share how you all can follow up if you have questions we don't get to. And to address the question that came in earlier, we all are recording this, as you heard when you jumped on, and we'll be sharing the materials to the slide deck, as well as the recording with all of you on the line, as well as any of your colleagues who might have registered and weren't able to attend today. So we've got a few questions around the office space reuse and the future of that. We talked a little bit about virtual work and hybrid work and how that is continuing to change and evolve as we go through the recovery from the pandemic. So what are you all seeing in terms of reuse for that office space? So Ken, you talked about how it's not an easy transition just to turn it into housing, right? But what are you seeing in terms of reuse of some of that space? And related to that, are you seeing any reuse into co-working space, or do you anticipate that being a trend that agencies might expect to see with some of their office space?
By the way, interesting question. The fact that WeWork declared bankruptcy yesterday. So I just, and they put 70 million square feet on the market, in a bankruptcy proceeding. So in my view, the office market is really sideways. But to Ken's point, I'd like him to weigh in. There are ways through it. And by the way, I would just suggest this. A lot of the questions are really implementation questions. And there's kind of there's a next iteration of this discussion, which is, how do you specifically implement today? And maybe that's something we can do with ILG, because I think that's where these questions are coming from, and we can't cover them all. But bottom line, not every piece of office is going to convert to residential. I think about 10 to 11%. And by the way, I saw a comment on material costs and sort of modular and new construction types. Yeah, it's really helpful if you have a siloed product like modular for residential. It's not that helpful when you're converting 60-foot spans in an office to residential that needs a window every 15 feet. Okay, so these are not going to be easy. Ken, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's there's a couple things. It's a distressed asset circumstance that many banks, I mean, you may have seen something where Brookfield just put a property on the market, but many banks are going to end up with some of this real estate. And I hate to say it, but the writing down of that asset value will actually be also something that needs to take place in order for the values of those things to reset. And therefore, opportunistic investors may be able to afford, on a lower return requirement, the purchase of those assets from banks. So that's a pretty distressed formula. The other thing within the office market and industry is medical office is something that still may make some sense. Now, I'm not saying a 30-story tower is going to convert to medical office, but I think there's going to be some creative solutions to, can medical office take on a little bit more of whatever office market is challenged right now in terms of vacancy, and then some other creative solutions. Maybe it's a place for health and wellness, because health and wellness is a big theme these days. So maybe the spas or the service industries or the fitness industry is an area or an opportunity for some of those uses to take on kind of a cool redesigned and revitalized office. I'm just thinking out of the box, because I don't think there's a silver bullet solution for what's going to happen to office. And like every asset class, here's the other thing: all office isn't the same, all retail isn't the same, all industrial isn't the same. So you've got office that's going to be an essential business district that's super vertical. It's majorly challenged. I think that's an REO asset that's going to go back to the bank and get re-underwritten. And then corporations are going to figure out, does it make sense for folks to come back in or not? And can they, and will they do that on a hybrid or hotel motel type basis? Lower scale office can probably be something that gets revitalized, reutilized for residential and other land uses, including some version of some industrial or last mile delivery. So I think it'll be a mixed bag.
Let me just say, there is an opportunity here for office, and it sort of straddles these tools. We know, when you saw that chart with 50, 60 billion of office product going back to the lenders, what's the first thing that will happen when that lender gets that loan in the next year? Guess what? Hi, assessor, I want to reduce the value of this asset. Okay, if you lay down a TIF district, pretty soon, it's like playing the stock market short. If you lay down that TIF district and you orchestrate that TIF district at where office product is likely to convert, as Ken says, suburban office or older office, if you include that, know that the reinvestment in office is going to be $300 to $400 a foot. So it's going to trade out. They're going to go to the assessor and say, wow, this building up off of $5 a foot is worth $250. And then they're going to put $300 a foot into it to get it to residential that can support the new values. Value capture. I mean, I'm not saying it's a perfect strategy. It's a strategy out of anguish, but to not look at that really makes no sense to us. So this is why these strategies work together. There's no standalone solution. You just can't write office off when you have, 30 Class C buildings in one area that you can put in a district, knowing that the private sector is going to invest $400 a foot or $300 a foot in the next 3 years. That would be a waste of opportunity. That's why we say the thinking is just different. It's just an idea.
And I would just add to that, I think, one of the things that's important is to look at what's around, as Ken indicated, there's no two offices the same, right? And so it's really looking around and looking at what are the other land use types, what are the assets, what are the things that you can potentially leverage to kind of create a vision for an area that you're basically going to be rethinking. And if you're going to induce that investment through an EIFD or some other type of mechanism to create that investment, it's really starting off with that vision casting now and trying to capture those opportunities and looking at what is the timing, as Larry's indicating, when can you time that market to really maximize that vision and that economic development strategy.
So getting creative, thinking outside the box, how these things overlay and interplay with each other, and what.
And by the way, Melissa,
the options
the other half of that, if if Damien knows he's got a suburban area that may go residential, may go industrial, I mean, that's a policy decision, but he could also put together an adaptive reuse ordinance that accelerates that reinvestment at $300 a foot. So freeze the base as it's going down, take your zoning and use it as a value accretive tool, and then take the upside and then put it to work on homelessness or whatever. I mean, these are the currencies that we're getting handed to us today. The difference is that we haven't been used to using. I saw a comment about surplus property taking away opportunities. I don't see it that way. I think you free your property from SLA and you figure out what works best for you. That's what you do. The idea is to get conversion value. The idea is to get accretion value. The idea is to get freedom and flexibility. And the biggest idea is to tie all of those to private investment for products that you think your community wants. You're in the playbook. You got to play those games, and that's the way it is. It's not necessarily a penalty. It's a forced opportunity. What becomes forced versus missed is our inability to put these ingredients together in a productive way.
I think that's a great lead into another kind of theme I'm seeing in some of these questions. And we'll see if we can get through maybe 2 more questions here. Lots of questions around attracting that private investment. So what can local agencies do? Maybe it's infrastructure investments or other things. What can they do to really set the stage to make them ideal places for private investment, or how can they attract that investment?
Yeah, I mean, Julio can weigh in, but the first thing that I think a city manager, he or she, should do is to figure out where their investment capital stacks are on the private side. You cannot fix what you do not know is broken. And so until you have a candid assessment of where these private sector projects that you've been counting on, that you think were coming through the door, that are probably not returning the calls anymore because their lenders stopped returning their call. That's the first item of discovery. I think once you know where they are, then you have these tools and policies that you can bring to the fore. I don't know if Julio, Damien, you want to weigh in on that, but that's what I would do as a strategic leader.
So start with an inventory.
Start with an inventory. What's broken out there? How broken is it? I mean, I can't really say a lot about it, but even in amazing Placentia, there are projects that are a little bit sideways. So Damien and his team with us are looking at ways to figure out how to help. And, it doesn't mean that we're not going to get an exchange of value for helping, right? I will tell you this, Cosmont's working on a big project in Los Angeles, 300 residential units. we're recommending to the public agency, again, I have some confidentiality here, to let that developer have a year to go search capital, because we think that that's the best augmentation, is to give them some time. In other cases, it may be, let's reset some zoning, let's reduce some parking, let's use our TIF district to provide a reimbursement of costs. Let's get Julio to create a CFD for the project and move as much of the public infrastructure costs in that private capital stack that either is unattainable, or 8 to 10% or 15%, move it to a tax exempt stack at 5%. These are all the things you have. None of them are perfect, but unless you know what the itch is, you can't scratch it.
You know, I can only tell you one other thing, Larry, and I think from a finance perspective, sometimes the deals don't make sense right now, just like you're saying, they're gonna write it down. And don't chase money after it. You can't fix other things, and sometimes it's gone through iterations. So any financial advice, if there's sticks in the ground, sometimes the best thing to do is just leave them at where they are until someone else comes in, has the capital conditions change. It's unfortunate, but that might be the most prudent advice, because you only have so many resources yourself.
And you're grappling with a bunch of those right now.
Yeah, and I think, you have deals, every community has different, development agreements, and some just, times have changed. You entered into those 2 years ago when the markets were much, much different. Access to, tax credits was different. Affordable housing is an all-time most competitive I've ever seen it in this industry in terms of tax credits, in terms of grant applications. So sometimes you just, you kind of have to wait and see, and there's different ways to do that. There's a total wait and see and long-term view, or there's what I call the shot clock, which is kind of what Larry's referring to, and put a performance period in some way to be creative to say, okay, if we did this and made some changes prospectively, that's if you get this, right? And so, but you put a performance period on it, it doesn't completely change the fundamentals of the deal. You give them an opportunity and kind of put them back on the back burner to go out and seek, capital, seek these grant funds, and really kind of make the developers work. And they're, as we've said, I think they're going to be working harder than they ever have, if, than I've ever seen, because of just the nature of the market.
I will say one other thing, the codes, Melissa, are changing, right? So we're going to a green set of building codes. So when Damien says that, he's right. When you reset a project, you may reset it and go to a different development standard because you're out of that business you were in the first place. Guess what? Those green codes may set the project up for ESG investors, for some other federal or state grants. It's because of the structural systems, the energy systems, and the impact of sort of, buildings are the largest contributor of carbon, and so to the extent that you can get a zero emission building because you've shifted product, you've shifted construction style, that's also perhaps a funding resource. Look, we're in a new world. There will not be easy solutions, especially when all of this avalanche of product hits the lending marketplace. You're going to have a lot of scared lenders out there. So all we have to do is just not panic and just understand what the new underwriting is, figure out where our tools work best. They won't work well all the time, right? To Julio's point, you just may have to walk away on some of these and wait for time to fix it. But for the ones that you can do something with, you can only do something with it if you understand the equation, understand their circumstances, and bring your value add elements to the fore. That's the new world. That's what we're going to see for the next couple of years. And I really do highly recommend, more of an implementation discussion, because that's where we are in the marketplace. And maybe ILG can think about that at some point.
Yeah, definitely. But so just kind of to summarize, so making sure you understand what the landscape is, doing that assessment and really understanding where your market's at, what the gaps are, and then thinking about how can you layer some of these tools. So maybe there is private financing, but maybe there's grant funding that's available to help get some of these components over the finish line, and just understanding the tools in your toolbox, right?
Right.
So I'm going to go ahead and get the screen share back going so I can share our contact information, since we are pretty much at time. But if you guys will humor me, I would love to get some quick thoughts on one other set of questions that I've seen a lot of energy around. So let me get through this real quickly, get some emails up on the screen here. But there's been a lot of questions around smaller and more rural communities as well. So any high level advice or any quick thoughts for some of our smaller jurisdictions or more rural jurisdictions on the line, and how to how to think through some of this or where to start even.
I think it's coming your way. The reality is that suburban and rural are the larger winners in an economy that is resizing from high density product and from office that operated in high density buildings. The world is just resetting, and people are picking where they move based on quality of life decisions. The key, though, for rural is understanding where their upside is in terms of making investments in resiliency and in infrastructure. And there is a brand new district called Climate Resiliency District that includes tax increment and special district financing all under one roof, if you will, that underwrites, wildfire resiliency, flood and resource management, sea level rise, and also the potential to underwrite insurance risk at some point. I think that's where rural communities ought to start looking, because they can couple economic development with the benefits of a different lifestyle that is all of a sudden much more attractive in a post-COVID digital world.
And we can definitely also share a link to information about those climate resiliency districts in the follow-up email to you all if you're interested. But Ken, Julio, Damien, any additional thoughts for smaller or more rural communities?
Well, I was just going to bring up the idea of the back to technologies and how the remote nature of where people are working and doing things and shopping really allow a lot more flexibility. And if you think about what happened during the pandemic, frankly, there was a bit of a flight away from those urbanized environments. I kind of looked at the county of LA and the county of Sacramento that I analyzed just in my presentation. And you saw some growth in areas within the Sacramento County. Not that Sacramento County is just rural, but it's got more rural components to it, if you will, than Los Angeles County to a degree. So when you look at that sort of demand for multifamily or even demand for office, you saw some of that growing during a period of time in some of those environments. I think that has something to do with the virtual nature of how we're all operating these days. So I think to that end, if you can work anywhere, the rural environments with some more appealing features, if you will, and maybe even a more affordable component to housing than these urbanized environments and coastal environments, smaller communities could benefit from that dynamic.
Yeah, and I think I would add that I think no community is too small to really have some form of an economic development strategy, or even coming up with your own brand, and looking at the opportunities. We started that out with Placentia a while ago. We're a bedroom community. A lot of people didn't think we'd had a lot of economic development opportunity, but we did a lot of things. We went to certain conferences, ICSC conference, for example, and other things, and really looked at both local in-city assets and then external regional assets. Like I mentioned, Cal State Fullerton or Disneyland, and really understanding their plans and creating those connections, and really looking at really the city as a kind of a canvas, if you will, and it's an opportunity to kind of create economic development. So if you have an airport, you're regional, but there's an airport next door, there's an opportunity there to look at that and partner with, Cosmon or like another consultant, for example, and look at, okay, what are the counts for the keys, and what's the saturation on and occupancy of those hotels, for example. Is there market share opportunity that your community adjacent that could leverage that you normally wouldn't think people would go there, but you never know? And so it's just kind of exploring these opportunities, creating your brand, creating your destination, and figuring out ways to make yourself unique, regardless if you're more rural or not. And then looking at unique centers like a downtown and capitalizing upon those.
Thinking about what
Hey,
makes your
Damien, we're
jurisdiction
working
unique
with
in the, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
Oh, Damien, we're working with a Central Valley community that has proactively said, I want to go to ICSC. I want to understand the opportunities. I'm going to evaluate those. I want to do an RFQ for different land uses, hospitality or otherwise. I want to brand myself. I think they're a case study for, what a more rural community is doing to be very proactive in the world of economic development. And not
Fantastic.
everybody's in that category. So I would flip that to say the do nothing strategy is probably not a great strategy at the end of the day.
Right.
So yeah, again, thinking about what makes you unique in the California landscape, and then to Damien's point, also thinking about regional assets as well as partnership opportunities. So who can you be connecting with and thinking as part of your equation, right? So we are a little bit over time. So any final thoughts from any of the panelists on the line before we let everybody go?
I just want to thank you. It's great. You know, you sat through a lot of information. Really appreciate it. A lot of the audience stayed with us. Maybe they just have nowhere else to go, but we certainly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, well, I hope the audience will join me in thanking our great panelists this afternoon, and thank you all for spending the last 90 minutes with us, and hope you got a lot of tips and tricks to think about in your agency. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.